Hello folks, tonight we begin in an attic, dusty, crooked, and absolutely refusing to meet any modern safety code. The kind of attic where the floorboards sigh under their own weight and the walls slope like they have seen things and would rather not talk about them. No one has been up here in decades, maybe longer. It smells like beeswax, old apples, and whatever ambition rots into when it is bottled and forgotten. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you are still awake enough to type, let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is. The range is always delightful and occasionally alarming. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The attic sits above a narrow townhouse in 16th century Prague during the golden age of please do not ask what is in the bottle. Inside, a collapsing workbench still carries the remains of someone's experiment. Scorch marks lick up the walls in a hopeful crescent. Several copper pans, one partially exploded, lean against a stone mortar that may once have hosted something edible, but probably did not. The former occupant, one Janek Melichar, was a scribe who, at some point around 1502, decided language was no longer enough and turned to the chemical arts. His goal? To isolate the human soul, preferably in a vial small enough to carry, just in case it needed to travel. What he left behind looks less like spiritual triumph and more like a very determined hazard zone. Bundles of herbs hang from the rafters, lavender, poppy, yarrow, a few that now only exist in books with "banned" on the spine. A faded manuscript, its corners curled like old toast, details a procedure involving mercury, boiled wine, and a precisely timed scream. Historians still argue whether this was a metaphysical ritual or just an extremely dramatic attempt to clean silverware. Some of the notes were not written, but scorched, letters burned into the parchment as if the ink had decided to rebel. One page suggests mixing gold dust with pigeon marrow, stirred counterclockwise until regret sets in. Whether that was a measurement or a warning is unclear. Tucked under a floorboard, a diary. Leather-bound, heat-warped, and full of equations with arrows pointing nowhere. The first few entries are structured enough. Ingredients lists, temperature notes, a complaint about poppies going missing, possibly eaten by mice or stolen by a rival alchemist. By page 30, things drift into cryptic shorthand and defensive sketches of a figure called the Red Visitor, sometimes drawn with horns, sometimes with a feathered hat, once as an owl with human hands. One page is titled Attempt 11, Spirit Distillation, Partial Success. Underneath, vial cracked, fumes irritating, laughter external, tooth still vibrating. Helpful. Another entry simply reads, The liquid blinked. I blinked back. This is now a stalemate. The attic's centerpiece, if one could call it that, is a narrow shelf filled with glass bottles. Some are empty, some glow faintly. One appears to have something moving inside it, though it might just be a trick of the light. Might. The labels are long since faded, though someone, perhaps Janek, perhaps the Red Visitor, has etched symbols into the glass with obsessive repetition. Spirals, eyes, a bird's foot. One bottle is sealed with wax, string, and something that might once have been a blessing. It hums faintly, not audibly, but the way a tooth hums after biting tinfoil. A sort of internal wince that lingers. There is also a note tied around one bottle's neck. It reads, Do not open near mirrors. It is underlined 3 times. The attic mirror, incidentally, is now covered with a black cloth, and has been since the early 1700s. No one will say why. In the far corner, a cage large enough to hold a child or a crouching adult. Inside, a cracked tooth, a coin half melted and fused to a jawbone, and a piece of cloth that still smells faintly of burnt cloves and something more medicinal, comforting. Next to it, a small wooden box containing several dried frogs, pressed flat like unfortunate bookmarks, and one rat skeleton holding what looks suspiciously like a quartz bead between its paws, possibly symbolic, possibly just a hoarding problem. There is also a comb, ivory, delicate, and absolutely out of place, wrapped in linen that is newer than the rest. The cloth is embroidered with the words sanguis sine nuba, blood without cloud. No one has been able to explain it, and the comb itself emits a faint static buzz when touched. The window in the gable lets in just enough moonlight to reveal outlines, but not much else. Yannick once noted that the light flickered on its own, even on windless nights. That entry has been heavily smudged, as though someone tried to erase it using only their thumb and fear. Still, Yannick seems to have believed he came close. In one final entry, scrawled across a half-burned scrap of parchment, he writes, "I have seen it, not in the mirror, in the shadow behind me. It watches when I dream. It fogs the glass. The soul resists," which is either profound or a sign of late-stage mercury poisoning, possibly both. A second scrap of parchment was used to blot something, ink, or maybe blood, though it is unclear whose. The note reads only, "No light after the 12th hour. It learns faster in darkness," which is not a sentence you want to find under your bed, let alone beneath your alchemy desk. No bodies were ever found, just a boot with the heel worn down from pacing. The fire in the brazier had gone cold, the bottles were sealed, and the attic, locked from the inside, was left alone. A few years later, when the next tenant tried to rent the townhouse, they reportedly heard glass clinking in the ceiling beams and moved out after one night. Something about breathing that did not belong to anything. Again, no follow-up. The neighbors, long used to strange noises, had stopped commenting. One local boy once climbed up the drainpipe on a dare and came back down pale, silent, and with a small cut on his palm he swore had just appeared. He did not speak again for 3 days. Then he asked for honey and never mentioned it again. At the back of the shelf, a drawer. It is warped but open. Inside, 5 vials, green, gold, red, something unpleasantly pearlescent, and one that is bone dry but smells like sandalwood and static electricity. A note underneath reads, "Name the element you fear most. Then do not look away." Nothing happens when anyone reads it, not immediately. But some say the drawer is always slightly ajar now, no matter how tightly it is closed. Some say the gold vial is missing, though no one admits to taking it. Some say it was never full to begin with. Memory is tricky in attics like these. Others think Yannick vanished into one of the bottles, metaphorically, spiritually, or otherwise. There is no consensus. But once, in the 1720s, a tax collector, inspecting the house, claimed the attic smelled of frankincense and burnt hair, and that he found a circle of ash around the workbench, unbroken and still warm to the touch. He sent no invoice and never returned. And then there is the crack in the back wall. Hairline. Harmless. Except that it is warm in winter and cold in summer. Someone once stuck a thermometer in it, and the mercury vanished, not boiled, just gone. Evaporated like it had somewhere else to be. One beam still bears fingerprints, charred into the grain. 3 fingers, 2 long, slightly curved, not quite human. The burn does not match any known flame pattern. Attempts to sand it down simply left the marks deeper. The city below has long since moved on. The wars came and went. The alley outside was paved, but the attic remains, quiet, full of dust, smoke residue, and that faint, humming silence that only lingers in rooms used for too many impossible things. No ghosts here, just traces, just scorched wood, failed ideas, and a dozen small glass bottles keeping their secrets. Alchemy, as it existed in the 1500s, was a confusing stew of science, mysticism, ambition, and absolutely no regard for personal safety. The goal was noble enough: unlock the secrets of nature, purify substances, and maybe, if time allowed, become immortal or impossibly rich. In practice, it often involved setting things on fire that should never be on fire, inhaling fumes that turned your teeth black, and developing a sincere hatred of lead. Still, alchemists across Europe pressed on, filling their journals with hopeful recipes for gold and accidental instructions for spontaneous combustion. The dream that bound them all together was the philosopher's stone. Not an actual stone usually, but an imagined substance of astonishing power. Supposedly, it could turn base metals like lead into gold, cure diseases, and grant eternal life. Its descriptions varied wildly depending on whom one asked. Some claimed it was red and waxy, others said it shimmered like glass, and one particularly enthusiastic French alchemist insisted it hummed when you insulted it. No one, it seems, could agree on what it was, but everyone agreed they wanted it. In Prague, workshops lit up the night with flickering green and yellow flames, each one a small beacon of human persistence and poor ventilation. Alchemists worked alone or in pairs, hunched over crucibles and alembics, stirring mixtures that hissed, sizzled, and occasionally tried to crawl out of the bowl. A popular combination was antimony, sulfur, and powdered eggshell. The result was usually a chalky mess that smoked and turned purple, which some took as progress. Others recorded it as failure number 97. One of the more notorious practitioners in the city was Anton Havel, a former bellmaker who claimed he could hear metal speak to him. He set up shop in a disused stable and immediately replaced all the horses with barrels of brine and moss. Within months, the neighbors were complaining of an unidentifiable stench, which Anton insisted was the smell of purification. They were not comforted. He wore gloves made of stitched pigskin, a tunic that may have once been velvet, and goggles so blackened they rendered him effectively blind after dusk. His experiments included bathing copper wire in wine and muttering Latin at it until sunrise. Anton's most famous disaster came during what was supposed to be a demonstration. He had invited two noblemen, one astrologer, and a very confused butcher to witness his latest transmutation. After heating a mixture of vinegar, ash, saltpeter, and essence of rabbit, he announced that gold would soon emerge. What emerged instead was a deafening bang, a 3-foot flame, and a fine white powder that coated everything in a 10-meter radius. The noblemen left unimpressed. The astrologer claimed the event was foretold. The butcher offered to buy the powder if it killed pests. Despite the failure, Anton's confidence never wavered. He declared the explosion a cleansing purge and insisted he had merely skipped ahead to Phase 7. He spent the next week gathering soot samples and asking street children to describe the taste of lightning. These kinds of setbacks were not uncommon. Alchemists treated the line between experiment and disaster as more of a polite suggestion. The fumes alone were a consistent hazard. Mercury vapor, arsenic dust, and lead residue were standard features in most laboratories, as were long, frantic coughing fits and occasional blindness. One gentleman recorded his symptoms with surprising clarity: blurred vision, ringing ears, heightened dreams, and a persistent urge to lick pewter. He titled the entry "Promising Reactions." Still, there was method in the madness. Among the wild theories and explosive failures, certain observations began to repeat. Heat changed substances. Certain metals reacted with acids in predictable ways. Vinegar etched copper. Alcohol could extract oils. Though they were centuries away from the language of modern chemistry, alchemists were slowly, clumsily discovering it. And in the process, they were lighting themselves on fire. One popular theory at the time insisted that everything in nature was made from 3 principles: salt, sulfur, and mercury. These were not the chemical elements we know today, but mystical essences. Salt represented the body, sulfur the soul, and mercury the spirit. Balance them properly and one could transform anything. In practice, balancing them usually involved getting salt in your eyes and breathing mercury vapor through a goat bladder funnel. The soul, meanwhile, tended to escape through the cracks. There was a certain poetry to it all. These people were not just mixing powders, they were trying to force the world to reveal its secrets. Every failed batch, every cracked vial was a kind of stubborn prayer. They believed deeply that matter could be elevated, that the base could become noble, that with enough heat and time, even the most worthless thing could turn to gold. It was a philosophy disguised as a craft and occasionally mistaken for a recipe. Their laboratories were often cramped, dimly lit rooms with uneven floors, makeshift stoves, and shelves bowing under the weight of ingredients labeled things like dragon's tears and red mother. Most were code names, some were just hopeful guesses. One inventory included rust scrapings, dried eel skin, horn filings, mummified mouse, and subtle earth. What made it subtle is still unclear. There was also a heavy dose of ritual involved. It was not enough to simply mix the right ingredients. Timing mattered. So did planetary alignment. Some instructions specified stirring a mixture only while Venus was rising. Others required silence during boiling or chanting during grinding. One manuscript recommended tapping the side of the flask with a silver spoon every 12 minutes while reciting a verse about purity. The line between procedure and performance was paper-thin and frequently crossed. Failures were often blamed on outside interference. The wrong kind of wood was burned. The moon was in the wrong phase. The assistant sneezed at the wrong moment. One record blames the neighbor's cat for a failed calcination process, citing its evil tail. Another describes a month-long series of setbacks caused by a chimney that whistled like a jealous demon. And these explanations were not always scientific, but they were consistent. Even the tools of the trade had names and personalities. Alembics were treated like confidants. Crucibles were blamed or praised depending on their results. Some alchemists gave their furnaces names: Mila, the consuming wife, Little Saint Flame. A good furnace was treasured, tended like a pet, and mourned when it cracked. One man reportedly wept openly when his favorite brazier failed mid-conjunction. And always, always, there was gold. No matter how many mixtures failed, no matter how many eyebrows were singed off, or lungs filled with fumes, they kept returning to the same dream. The base made noble, the worthless made valuable, lead into gold, death into life, rot into revelation. The more cynical observers of the time called them charlatans, and not without reason. Some were indeed frauds, peddling miracle elixirs and disappearing just before the town physician returned. Others were true believers, earnest and obsessed. It was hard to tell the difference. Sometimes the frauds became believers themselves. Sometimes the believers sold snake oil out of desperation. Alchemy had very few clean lines. In the end, most of the gold they produced was metaphorical. But there was something undeniable about their pursuit. It was not just the fire, the flasks, or the fumes. It was the idea that the world was not fixed, that it could be transformed, that even in failure one could inch closer to something pure. Back in Prague, Anton Havel finally stopped his experiments in the winter of 1511 after accidentally turning his teeth green and rendering his chimney permanently flammable. He spent the next 6 years quietly translating Arabic texts and insisting that the secret had already been found, just not yet understood. His workshop, abandoned and still faintly smoky, remained locked until a curious bookseller opened it in 1579 and promptly fainted. Inside he found 12 jars labelled in code, 2 crucibles fused together like lovers in a fire, and a note pinned to the door that read, "If this room breathes, do not inhale." No one ever figured out what the 12th jar contained. There was a particular kind of alchemist in the 1500s who blurred the line between herbalist and hazard. These were not the cloaked scholars working in libraries or those mumbling to alembics in cellars. These were the wanderers, the hedge brewers, the kitchen fire philosophers who believed the secrets of the soul could be found in roots, seeds, minerals, and the occasional household poison. They were halfway between doctor and local menace, and in more than one case, both. One of the more memorable examples lived in Brno on the eastern edge of the kingdom. His name was Mikulas Sedlacek, though few used it. In town records, he was simply the Mercurial. Whether that referred to his disposition or his ingredient list was never fully clarified. Mikulas operated out of a converted grain barn at the end of a lane no one visited willingly. By day, he sold tonics for joint pain, potions for melancholy, and something labeled oil for dreams. By night, the windows of his barn glowed purple, and the air smelled faintly of roasted garlic and copper. Mercury was his passion. He believed it was the physical embodiment of divine intent, liquid and shifting like the soul unbound by flesh. He once told a visiting bishop that blood and Mercury had more in common than most people realized. The bishop did not return. Mikulas wore gloves when he remembered and talked often about how heat revealed truth. He used a small brass crucible shaped like a teardrop, which he claimed hissed when fed pure ingredients. No one else ever heard the sound, but that did not stop him from listening. Mercury was not a rare substance in alchemical practice, but Mikulas took its use to unusual extremes. He used it as a base in his tinctures. He applied it topically to patients complaining of fevers. He even attempted to purify it by passing it through silk filters and blessing it with chants adapted from old psalms. The results were mixed. His handwriting became noticeably shakier with each passing year. So did his moods. In his later journals, found much later under a floorboard soaked in vinegar, he described what he called soul shimmering, a condition where the boundaries of the self began to blur after prolonged mercury exposure. He claimed to have caught glimpses of other people's memories. Sometimes he would describe conversations he could not have had. Other times he wept for people who never existed. He believed the soul, when saturated with enough divine metal, began to loosen, to float. Not everything Mikulas did was theoretical. He was considered by many to be a skilled herbalist, if a reckless one. He made poultices that healed cracked skin and teas that calmed coughing children. He was known to carry dried mint, wormwood, and crushed rose hips in his sleeves. One of his most requested recipes was a sleeping draught made from valerian, milkweed, and something he only ever called veil root. The concoction was said to bring restful dreams and sometimes visions. Whether that was a feature or a warning depended on who you asked. He also believed emotions could be distilled. Anger was heavy and metallic. Joy bubbled. Grief had a sweetness to it. He attempted to trap these in flasks. One such container, still sealed with a lump of tar and string, bears a label, "Laughter, second hour, after storm." The liquid inside is cloudy and smells of lemon balm and old coins. No one has opened it in centuries. Mikulas did not work alone. He had an apprentice named Dita, a girl of about 13 when she began her training. She wore her hair in braids and spoke very little. In town, people said she had been born with 2 shadows and that one of them moved on its own. No one ever confirmed it. She kept the fire lit, recorded the experiments, and occasionally redirected clients when Mikulas became too absorbed in one of his moods to speak. Dita's own notes, found tucked inside a book of charms and preserved herbs, suggest she was the more practical of the two. Her writing is clear and steady. She records ingredients, ratios, symptoms. She writes things like, "Client appears to respond well to tincture of fennel and vinegar," and "Do not mix St. John's wort with powdered opal again. Reaction unpredictable." Once, she added, "Mercury did not eat again today. He says the soul is too noisy." It was Dieter who attempted the first documented distillation of sorrow. The process required a copper coil, a clay filter, and a sample of weeping. She collected the latter from a widow named Clara, who had recently buried her son. The distillate was pale, nearly clear, with a faint shimmer. When placed beneath the tongue, it reportedly caused the drinker to see their own reflection standing behind them. Dieter wrote, "Not dangerous, but unsettling, perhaps useful for contrition." The more spiritual alchemists believed the mind could be mapped by taste, bitterness, longing, sweetness, memory. Acrid flavors revealed fear. Mercury built a tasting board from cedar and bone, not for food, but for liquids drawn from rare compounds and emotional distillates. The apprentice noted that he once recoiled from a sample labeled "unspoken betrayal" and laughed for a full minute after tasting accidental kindness. No matter how strange their theories became, both master and apprentice documented everything: measurements, times, colors, smells, and the way the room felt after a mixture settled. Dieter used small wax seals to catalogue different stages. She also began making diagrams, circles within circles, spirals that pointed inward, symbols borrowed from prayer books and altered slightly. They resembled mandalas but with more teeth. In their final year together, records grow sparse. Mercury appears to have become increasingly erratic, obsessed with bottling something he called the last echo. He stopped selling potions. He stopped answering the door. Neighbors said they saw smoke that changed color throughout the day, blue in the morning, green at dusk, and violet at midnight. The animals in nearby barns refused to walk past the lane. When the barn was eventually entered, years later, it had collapsed inward. The walls were scorched from the inside. A circle of stone remained unburned in the center, and on it, a single sealed flask sat untouched. Dieter was never found. Mercury was gone. The flask is currently held in a private collection. The label has faded, but some believe it once read, "Presence." Not all alchemists were as poetic, nor as tragic, but many shared a belief that emotions, thoughts, even souls, were not beyond the reach of heat and pressure, that with enough care or enough recklessness, anything could be extracted, that the human condition, like all things, could be bottled. The world of alchemy in the 1500s was not only a matter of powders and metals, it was just as much a world of longing, deception, and strange intimacy. Love potions, in particular, occupied a curious position, dismissed by learned men as superstition, but requested often enough to keep entire side industries quietly flourishing. Wherever hearts broke, where inheritances stalled, or when marriages were arranged but not yet affectionate, someone, somewhere, brewed a little help in a glass vial. The recipes varied wildly. Some claimed all that was needed was rosewater and nutmeg. Others demanded much more questionable ingredients: hair from the intended target, ash from a burned love letter, a small piece of apple chewed exactly 13 times. One infamous blend from southern France required a drop of blood, and the petal of a flower grown only beside gallows. Was it symbolic? Possibly. Was it marketable? Extremely. These concoctions were usually not advertised publicly. No signboards declared true love bottled fresh. Instead, they passed from hand to hand, whispered about in taverns, sold discreetly from kitchen doors, or slipped into the baskets of housemaids. The buyers came from all walks of life: nervous young apprentices, lonely widows, hopeful merchants, and occasionally noble women who had grown tired of waiting politely for affection to bloom. There was no official formula. Some were syrups, thick, honeyed, and infused with herbs like basil and lemon balm. Others came as powders to be stirred into wine. A few were oils meant to be dabbed onto clothing, although the scent was often described as intensely confusing. Most claimed to induce attraction, admiration, or emotional openness. A few promised obsession, which many later regretted. Whether they worked was a matter of heated debate. Most historians agree that the effects were psychological, not chemical, but the mind, after all, is a powerful cauldron of its own. If a person believed they had swallowed affection, they often behaved more tenderly, more openly, and if the object of their desire was already half-willing, the rest was simply momentum. The real risk lay in dosage and expectation. A pinch of vervain in wine might relax someone. A spoonful of belladonna mixed with honey might kill them. There was a fine line between encouragement and poisoning, and not every brewer respected it. In the city of Olomouc, one alchemist was chased from his quarters after 3 of his clients reported that their intended lovers became strangely silent, cold to the touch, and unresponsive to bells. He swore it was a misunderstanding. The demand for such potions was highest during festivals, betrothals, and times of war. When young men went to fight, their sweethearts often sought something to bind their affections tightly before departure. Rings were exchanged, yes, but also small phials. Sometimes the departing soldier never drank the gift. Sometimes he did, and came back only to report intense dreams and an aversion to rosemary. One letter from a soldier in the Austrian frontier read, "Tell Elixirs I remember her face, though it has changed colours in my sleep. Also, I cannot stop smelling oranges." Not all love potions were made with romance in mind. Some were brewed to end affairs, not begin them. These were the so-called soft severings, meant to dull affection and encourage distance. Valerian root, lemon peel, ash, and violet water, not harmful, just numbing. A woman in Prague wrote in her journal of dosing her husband every Sunday until he fell in love with silence. He eventually moved to the countryside, citing divine inspiration and an interest in bees. For those unable to afford a proper potion, charm papers were a cheaper alternative. These were small slips of parchment covered in symbols, folded 7 times and sewn into clothing. Some included biblical verses written backward. Others used sigils borrowed from astrology. One common charm advised the wearer to touch it every time the object of their affection passed nearby. Theoretically, this created an energy link. Realistically, it encouraged fidgeting and awkward stares. The church frowned on all of it officially. Love was to be pure, sanctioned, and preferably chaste. But enforcement was uneven. In wealthier parishes, priests were often more concerned with property disputes and tithes. In rural regions, love magic was so embedded in courtship traditions that condemning it would have ended most village festivals. In many towns it was simply tolerated as long as no one died and the pig returned to its proper owner. One especially detailed account comes from a baker's apprentice named Marek, who fell desperately in love with a cooper's daughter. After several ignored gifts and one unsuccessful poem about barrels and destiny, Marek sought help from a woman known only as Old Tana. She lived in a lime-washed hut near the river and was said to speak with mushrooms. For 2 coins and a promise never to bring lawmen, she gave him a small corked bottle with a warning: "Use only when she smiles." According to Marek's notes, which were later found in the margins of his flower ledger, he added a few drops of the potion to a plum tart and delivered it to the cooper's daughter. She accepted it, smiled politely, and gave half to her grandmother. The girl fell into a long nap and dreamed of geese. The grandmother, upon waking, declared she would remarry and did so within the year. Marek eventually became a respected miller and was never quite sure what went wrong. there were also instances when both parties knowingly drank such potions together. These were more symbolic than chemical, a mutual agreement to open the door between them, assisted by cinnamon and clove. Many couples claimed it worked. Whether because of the ingredients or the shared ritual is difficult to say. In love, intention can matter more than formula. Love potions also made their way into plays, stories, and folk songs. They were often used as plot devices, sometimes comic, sometimes tragic. A famous ballad from Moravia tells of a girl who gave her heart to a stranger and later learned he had brewed her name into his wine. The chorus repeats, "She wept into bread, he vanished with stars, the cup still warm, the sky still far." Children sang it with varying levels of understanding. In some rare cases, love magic veered into obsession. Letters were burned, hair was taken, footprints were bottled. These were no longer acts of yearning, but of control. The line between affection and coercion became dangerously thin. In Vienna, a merchant's wife accused her husband of keeping her under enchantment, claiming she had not wept in 5 years. When questioned, he presented a sealed jar labeled regret, bound with copper. The jar was later lost during a house fire. Whether it caused the fire is unknown. Even among the more careful alchemists, the topic of love potions was treated with unease. It was too subjective, too emotional, too full of unintended consequences. One philosopher wrote, "The soul may be coaxed, but never commanded. To command it is theft. To trick it, blasphemy." He then added a recipe for cordial that included rose hips and salt for those who wished to speak kindly. Some formulas veered into culinary territory. Records from a bohemian kitchen note a spiced pudding meant to ease romantic anxiety made with milk, nutmeg, orange zest, and a single clove wrapped in paper. One entry claims that the dish led to 3 marriages and 1 mysterious disappearance. Another details bread for banishment, a dense rye loaf laced with bitter aloes and dried nettle, intended to encourage unfaithfulness to leave quietly. It was sometimes fed to unfaithful lovers, sometimes to relatives, and yet for all the warnings, for all the failed attempts, people continued to seek out these mixtures. They wanted connection, they feared loneliness, they were willing to believe in the possibility of enchantment, if only for a night. A few drops in a goblet, a murmur in the dark, and maybe, just maybe, the heart might tip toward them. It was not science, it was not entirely faith, it was something in between. The alchemist, when asked why so many of these potions were commissioned but so few worked, reportedly answered, "Because most people do not want love, they want certainty, and nothing in this world can promise that, not even me." In cities, large and small, tucked between bakeries and blacksmiths, alchemists often found themselves at odds with their neighbors. Their craft was smoky, noisy, and carried the scent of anxiety mixed with burnt citrus. To the people who lived nearby, these mysterious figures were not mystical philosophers. They were that strange person who made the walls tremble at midnight and who always had unusual stains on their fingers. And so the complaints began. It often started with the smell. Alchemical work required heat, and heat released vapors. The fumes from boiling urine, vinegar, sulfur, and unknown extracts tended to wander. One family in Krakow reportedly moved house after their baby began sneezing every time the wind blew from the alchemist's direction. Another household blamed their neighbor's laboratory for the sudden and inexplicable bitterness of their well water. They did not drink it after that, and neither did their dog. Sounds were another frequent problem. Alchemists tapped glass, ground powder, chanted invocations, and sometimes shouted when things exploded. Many believed that the success of a distillation depended on rhythmic clapping. One practitioner played a bone flute to settle the vapors. His neighbor, a retired carpenter, wrote a formal complaint that stated, "The spirits may be real, but they do not enjoy music." He moved away shortly after, leaving behind a fence decorated with iron nails and garlic, just in case. There was also the problem of light. Alchemical fires burned strange colors. Windows glowed green or purple at odd hours. Some flames appeared to hover, fueled by substances that even the alchemist could not always name. Townsfolk whispered about shadows that flickered in reverse, or reflections that smiled before the person did. Many houses began to keep their shutters closed, even in summer. Perhaps the most unnerving were the sounds that were not mechanical. Screeches, whispers, moans. These were often blamed on the alchemist's cat, if one existed. If not, people blamed spirits. One woman in Vienna insisted that her curtains had begun to twitch toward the noise on their own. Her priest suggested holy water. Her cat left entirely. Superstition clung tightly to alchemists, not because of what they promised, but because of what they caused. Fires broke out, rats multiplied, mold crept in unfamiliar patterns, milk soured in locked cabinets, children developed fevers, and then recovered with odd memories. One boy insisted he had dreamed of a man with glass teeth who said he was made of stars. His parents asked no further questions. Most alchemists ignored the gossip. They had work to do, and gossip never turned lead into gold. Others attempted to smooth things over. They offered charms for healthy crops, potions for quieter sleep, or salves for aching joints. Sometimes these gifts helped. More often, they were accepted with thanks and then buried in the yard. No one wanted to offend the one person in town who kept bottles labeled distilled shadow and powder of whisper. In cities where fear grew stronger than curiosity, authorities began to step in. Officials did not understand alchemy, but they understood angry citizens. Ordinances were passed. Permits were required. Some cities banned experiments after sunset. Others limited the number of furnaces per household. A few required alchemists to place warning signs outside their workshops. One such sign read, "Do not knock unless you wish to change." It was stolen within a week. In Prague, a city rich with magical history, the tension between alchemists and neighbors reached a breaking point in 1554. That year, a man named Willem Prochaska accidentally flooded his street with green foam that hissed when touched. He had been attempting to separate joy from envy using egg whites and vinegar. The mixture instead created a reaction that expanded across cobblestones, into gardens, and through one very surprised chicken coop. Witnesses described the foam as warm, soft, and muttering. It receded after 3 hours, leaving behind a faint mint scent and 24 strangely polished stones. Willem was fined heavily and forbidden from further emotional extractions. He apologized in writing, stating, "The heart is more volatile than I expected." Not all incidents were so colorful. Some were tragic. In a small town outside Graz, an alchemist known only as Peter collapsed during an experiment involving tin and crushed pearls. He died within hours. His neighbors, who had once petitioned for his removal, came forward to say they had seen a blue fire in his chimney that morning. They now claimed it was a sign of divine protest. The town declared the house cursed and refused to rent it for years. Eventually it was converted into a bakery, though some claimed the bread always smelled faintly of lavender and regret. These tensions shaped the way alchemists worked. Many moved their laboratories underground. Basements, cellars, even old wells were repurposed into hidden spaces for experimentation. Some operated from carts, moving from town to town. A few traveled under false names, claiming to be healers, brewers, or traveling clerks. One man wore a priest's robe and dispensed potions from a hollow crucifix. He was arrested twice, but his customers remained loyal. Despite public disapproval, demand never disappeared. People still wanted cures, fortunes, and charms. They simply wanted them quietly. Alchemists learned to adapt. They disguised their tinctures as cooking oil, their powders as flour. Glassware was stored in bread tins. Books were rebound with hymn covers. One especially cautious woman in Brno kept her journals inside hollowed-out loaves, which she delivered weekly to her aunt. Her aunt never questioned the weight. Neighbors, for their part, developed strategies of their own. Some avoided eye contact with alchemists altogether. Others offered small bribes to be left alone. A few took the opposite approach and befriended the strange figures in their midst. These friendships were often strange and quiet, marked by gifts of dried herbs, water that never spoiled, or candles that burned without smoke. Children were often more curious than afraid. They watched from behind barrels, climbed trees to peek into windows, and occasionally stole things. One girl in Bratislava reportedly collected over 200 small corks and arranged them by scent. Another claimed her pockets were full of dream crumbs. She refused to explain. A boy near Timișoara supposedly kept a locket that never opened, given to him by a traveling alchemist who told him, "It is already full." In time, these uneasy arrangements became part of daily life. The baker complained of smoke but accepted a tincture for his wife's rheumatism. The seamstress gossiped but still bought powders to make her linen gleam. The town crier shouted about strange smells but sometimes stayed behind after dark to ask quiet questions. Alchemists, for all their fire and noise, had become woven into the fabric of the neighborhood. Strange threads, but threads nonetheless. The alchemists themselves were not unaware of their reputation. Some leaned into it, wearing cloaks, speaking in riddles, and cultivating mystery. Others tried to appear normal, but struggled when asked simple questions like, "What do you do for a living?" or "Why is the air around your house always damp?" Most settled into a kind of uneasy peace with their communities, a tolerated presence, feared and needed in equal measure. Eventually, as the scientific revolution took shape, alchemy would be driven to the margins. But in the mid-1500s it still thrived in its awkward, smoky state, half miracle and half menace. And wherever an attic glowed late into the night, somewhere beneath it, a neighbor muttered into their pillow and wondered if their soup would taste strange again. There were some alchemists who never worked in solitude. Instead of hidden attics or rural barns, they operated within the grand houses of the nobility, financed by gold, protected by walls, and often pressured by expectation. These men were not unknown eccentrics. They were known eccentrics invited deliberately by the powerful to explore the boundaries of matter, spirit, and sometimes reason. It was in these places that the strangest experiments often took place, shielded from public scrutiny by thick stone and thicker reputations. One such nobleman was Lord Karol Radomir, a Bohemian aristocrat with an estate large enough to be its own province. He fancied himself a man of vision. His library contained more books on astrology than on agriculture. He held long discussions with artists about the shape of beauty and with physicians about the location of the soul. When he heard of an alchemist named Florian arriving in Prague, he sent a carriage immediately. Florian was a quiet man, educated in Padua, fluent in Latin, and reluctant to speak unless directly asked. His robes were plain, but his eyes had the sort of depth people described in metaphors involving wells or obsidian. Upon arrival at Radomir's manor, he was shown not to a guest room, but to a locked cellar beneath the stables. There, the lord had prepared a laboratory, stone-walled, fireproofed, and equipped with tools from across Europe. The furnace had its own chimney, the shelves were bowed with ingredients. A goat waited in the corner, tethered and chewing its tether. Lord Radomir had one request: to make something new. Not gold, not immortality, something no one had made before, a substance, a creature, a force, something that could not be found in the natural world. Florian agreed without hesitation. For the next 2 years, little was seen of him. He emerged occasionally to request items: ink made with octopus blood, glass from Alexandria, the preserved eye of a lynx, 4 kilograms of bone meal, or a jar of rain caught on Midsummer's Eve. Radomir provided everything. The household staff began to refer to the cellar as the lower court and avoided it entirely. At night, faint humming could be heard through the floorboards, sometimes chanting. Once, a laugh that did not sound like it came from only one mouth. No one questioned Florian's methods. Radomir was pleased, and that was enough. Guests to the manor were told the noise came from pipes or from the goat. Most believed it. One did not, and returned to Vienna 3 days early with an excuse involving his digestion. Then came the morning when the goat was gone. No one had heard it bleat or struggle. The tether remained neatly coiled. The staff assumed it had escaped, though the cellar door was still locked from the inside. Florian made no mention of it. When asked, he said only, "The cycle has completed." No one asked again. That winter, the weather turned bitter. Snow arrived early and did not leave. Ice crept into the corners of rooms that had always stayed warm. The manor's dogs refused to go near the cellar. At dinner, guests remarked that the fire no longer felt hot, even when seated beside it. One noblewoman claimed her wine tasted like memory. Another said the mirrors in her chamber showed her smiling before she did. Lord Radomir laughed, delighted. "Proof," he said, "that the boundaries are thinning." Florian continued his work. It was said that he no longer slept. His beard grew patchy. His fingers darkened at the tips. The cellar began to vibrate, at first barely perceptible. Then, like a purring beneath the floor, the humming became louder. A new odor emerged like burnt feathers and wet stone. Late one night, Radomir went down to the cellar alone. He was gone for several hours. When he returned, he was pale and silent. He sat at the long dining table and refused food. When asked what he had seen, he replied, "I have witnessed novelty." He did not elaborate. After that, Florian ceased requesting ingredients. The cellar door remained closed. The humming quieted. The snow outside began to melt, though the region remained under cloud. A faint mist hung around the manor for 9 days, regardless of wind or sun. Birds did not land on the roof. Local children whispered that the chimney blinked. Eventually, the door to the cellar was found open. Inside, the shelves were empty. The furnace was cold. The jars were clean and bone dry. Florian was not there. On the floor sat a single object, a cube roughly the size of a bread loaf, perfectly smooth. Its surface shimmered in colors that did not have names. When touched, it felt dry and wet at once. When tapped, it made no sound. A note sat beside it, written in Florian's careful hand. "This is the shape of absence. I hope it satisfies." Lord Radomir ordered the cellar sealed. He dismissed half his staff and refused visitors for months. The cube was placed in a lead-lined box and stored in the manor's deepest vault. He forbade anyone to speak Florian's name again. When asked years later about the incident, he replied only, "Creation is heavier than I expected." Rumors spread, as they always do. Some said the cube now resides in a museum, unlabeled. Others claimed it vanished one night, leaving behind only a circle of frost. A few believe that Florian created something alive, and that it simply learned how not to be seen. One theory suggests the cube is not a substance at all, but a doorway, a static one-way passage to a different state of being, a kind of prison, or perhaps a mirror, without a world to reflect. According to this interpretation, Florian did not vanish. He stepped inside, he folded himself into whatever laws governed that object, and is now somewhere else entirely, unreachable but not necessarily lost. The case of Radomir and Florian remains one of the most puzzling footnotes in alchemical history. There are no records of the cube being studied, no confirmed sightings of Florian afterward, no explanation for the goat, the weather, or the strange mist. Historians still argue whether the entire tale was embellished, or whether something truly was created in that cellar, something outside the usual logic of substance and fire. In a field already full of strange claims, this one stands apart. It is not about transmutation, it is not about elixirs or extended life, it is not even about power. It is about novelty, the terrifying possibility that the world can still be surprised, that something entirely new might emerge, not from nature, but from intent, from obsession, from a mind locked in a room with just enough resources and too much permission. The manor still stands, though few visit it. The local maps omit it. The nearest village refers to it simply as the house. Some say the cube is still beneath it. Others believe it was never real. But one former servant, many years later, described something strange, the sound of a heartbeat, deep underground, slow and steady like stone remembering what it was shaped to become. And on the coldest mornings, when the mist gathers thick and the crows keep their distance, some swear they see a man near the edge of the woods. He wears plain robes, his eyes are very deep, and he never leaves footprints in the snow. Not all alchemy happened in silence. Some of it chattered, clucked, and sometimes screamed. For every refined study performed by candlelight, there were rituals that involved feathers, claws, and planetary calendars that insisted Mercury's position determined whether an egg would hatch correctly. And so, tucked behind libraries and lurking in smoky corners, there were alchemists who relied just as much on birds as they did on books. In the lowlands of Bohemia, there existed a curious tradition among certain fringe alchemists. These men, often dismissed as barn sorcerers by their more academic peers, believed chickens were excellent conduits for cosmic energy. Not because they were majestic or mysterious, but because they were abundant, emotionally unburdened, and highly responsive to certain vapors. A document recovered from the town of Jilava describes a typical ritual. It begins with a circle drawn in lime and powdered mint, a basin filled with rosewater and vinegar, and a live chicken placed in the center. The alchemist then chants a short invocation and introduces small amounts of a mysterious powder, labeled simply as sky ash. If the chicken flaps once and then settles, the mixture is deemed balanced. If it flaps twice, the ratio needs adjusting. If it explodes into movement and flees the circle, the alchemist writes down bad omen and begins again the next day. These experiments were not limited to birds. Rabbits were consulted. Frogs were kept in jars. One alchemist claimed his best assistant was a tortoise that would hum when exposed to the right blend of cinnamon and mercury. Another bred pigeons that he swore turned their heads toward useful constellations. Historians still argue whether any of this had meaning or whether it was simply a kind of desperate trial and error that occasionally made sense by accident. One of the more elaborate practices was the use of star incubation. An alchemist would mark eggs with astrological symbols, whisper planetary names over them each morning, and place them in special warming boxes lined with fragrant herbs. If the egg hatched, the chick was tested for symbolic traits, unusual feather color, distinct markings, or irregular behavior. If it chirped in minor keys, so much the better. These chicks were kept and, in some cases, elevated to ritual partners. If not, they were returned to the coop and left to their own less celestial lives. Much of this stemmed from the belief that living creatures could align themselves with cosmic rhythms more easily than human minds. Alchemists viewed animals as unclouded receivers of divine energy, natural instruments for reading the sky, the soul, and the strange rules that govern change. This belief often led to extensive breeding projects. One practitioner in Sopron reportedly bred 247 mice over the course of 6 years, documenting their reactions to different incense blends. He claimed that sorrow could be smelled, but only by the 3rd generation. These methods may sound absurd now, but they were not viewed as marginal by their practitioners. To them, the line between chemistry and spirit was thin, and animals, by virtue of their simplicity, were already halfway to whatever lay beyond. One prominent alchemist wrote that, "The beast does not question the fire, it dances when it feels warmth." And that same man kept a rooster named Eustace, who was trained to peck twice when the mixture was stable. Eustace died of natural causes and was given a small funeral. Of course, not all animal-assisted experiments ended peacefully. There is an infamous case from a cellar in Augsburg. The alchemist there, whose name has been lost but is remembered simply as the one with the bells, attempted to synchronize a flock of geese with the lunar cycle. He hung small brass chimes around their necks, fed them fermented mushrooms, and played flute music at sunset. After 3 weeks, the birds stopped honking. They began to move together in slow, deliberate patterns. On the 28th day, they gathered in a circle and faced east. The alchemist documented this with excitement. On the 29th day, they broke through the cellar door and vanished into the forest. They were never seen again. Some towns grew uneasy with these rituals, chickens disappearing, strange powders floating through the air, people whispering about goats that glowed faintly in the dark. Authorities began to intervene. Certain cities banned the use of live animals in laboratories. Others taxed any household that kept more than 6 birds, fearing they would be used for something other than eggs. Alchemists adapted. They turned to symbols, diagrams, and dreams. Still, some continued the older ways, often in secret. In one preserved letter, a young apprentice in Silesia describes helping her master bury 7 eggs in a spiral pattern on the night of a lunar eclipse. She writes, "He said the earth will remember this shape. He said that things grow better when the ground is curious. Whether anything did grow is not recorded." The fascination with animals also extended to their remains. Horns were ground into powder. Claws were burned and sifted. Feathers, especially those from birds found dead without violence, were considered spiritually potent. An owl feather found beneath snow was worth more than silver. It was believed to carry silence into the brew. One formula called for a feather that has never known light. What exactly that meant was unclear. Some alchemists interpreted it as requiring a chick to be raised in darkness. Others simply dug through barns at night. These ingredients were not always used directly. Often they were placed beside the mixture, meant to influence the result through proximity. A fox tooth on the table might sharpen a potion's effect. A crow's eye in a jar might give it memory. These additions were never explained directly. When asked, most alchemists said something vague like, "The materials speak to one another." It was not meant to be literal, but in some cases the mixtures did bubble differently when the right feather was near. Among the more cautious practitioners, there emerged a practice of apology. Before involving an animal, especially in risky experiments, a ritual was performed. A circle was drawn, bread and salt were offered, a phrase was recited, "I ask with hands that tremble, I learn with breath not my own." This was not universal, but where it was practiced, incidents of mishap reportedly decreased, or at least the results were gentler. The deeper one looks into the records, the clearer it becomes that some alchemists viewed animals not as tools, but as collaborators. Notes describe roosters refusing to crow before sunrise after certain experiments. A frog kept in one alchemist's care reportedly blinked only once every 20 hours and was said to measure stillness. A cat adopted by an old herbalist in Moravia was noted for sleeping beside the furnace only when mixtures were approaching completion. These observations were recorded not as anomalies but as indicators. There were also stories that drifted further from reason. A tale from southern Poland speaks of an alchemist who created a ring of ash that no animal would cross. Birds flew around it, insects skirted it, dogs refused to bark when placed inside. The alchemist disappeared shortly after. Another rumor from the Baltic coast tells of a boy born after his mother assisted with feather boiling. The boy never blinked. He later became a musician known for songs that made adults cry and windows rattle. Whether these tales are literal truths, symbolic fables, or misunderstood records of real phenomena, no one can say. What is clear is that the relationship between alchemists and animals was complex, reverent, curious, sometimes exploitative, but often strangely gentle. They saw animals not as lower creatures but as emissaries, half-born between instinct and whatever strange currents swirled just out of reach. Somewhere in all this noise, real insight may have emerged. Patterns, interactions, reactions that changed based on more than temperature or time. The variables were unpredictable, but alchemists were not looking only for control. They were looking for messages, something hidden in the chaos that might blink once and be gone. A bird twitching at the exact moment the mixture turned blue. A frog stilling just as the fumes cleared. To them, this was not superstition, it was communication, misunderstood, but sincere. In a field already filled with unstable glass, smoky corners, and unexplainable results, these rituals were not the most dangerous thing an alchemist could try. But they were among the strangest because they involved life, not just matter, because they asked living creatures to participate in mysteries no one fully understood, and because sometimes, just sometimes, something looked back. It was inevitable, perhaps, that alchemy would attract paperwork. By the mid-1500s, kings, dukes, and various mildly paranoid bureaucracies began to take more than a passing interest in what their alchemists were doing. The promise of gold from lead, of medicines that could cure anything, or of substances that defied nature, it was all too tempting to leave unregulated. And so alchemy began its slow drift into bureaucracy. In Prague, royal oversight arrived with velvet gloves and very sharp ink pens. The court established the Bureau of Transmutational Affairs, a small office with high ceilings, heavy furniture, and a constantly simmering atmosphere of polite suspicion. Alchemists who wished to practice within city limits were required to register. They had to list their specializations, submit samples, and in some cases, swear oaths promising not to set anything on fire without notice. The records from this period are revealing. Applications include careful lists of ingredients, statements of intent, and occasionally bribes disguised as gifts of rare salt. One applicant stated his expertise was in the extraction of vibrational heat from disappointed stone. Another simply wrote, "I seek nothing but understanding, and if gold should appear, I will not be upset." Most were granted provisional status, pending inspection. Inspections were their own kind of performance. Officials, often accompanied by scribes and once by a violinist for morale, would arrive unannounced to observe the laboratory in operation. They were not trained in chemistry, they did not understand the diagrams, but they knew what chaos looked like. If the ceiling was blackened, if the windows were cracked, or if the air smelled too much like boiled honey and fear, they would take notes. Lots of notes. Alchemists responded in different ways. Some cleaned frantically before each visit. Others developed hidden compartments. A few leaned into the absurd, claiming that their work required mirrors facing east, dried orchids, or complete silence for 3 hours every Thursday. These claims were rarely questioned. The officials had a great deal of paperwork and very little curiosity. In some cities, alchemy became a recognized trade. Guilds formed, apprentices were registered, dues were collected. Training programs were established, which included modules like basic flame control, ingredient etiquette, and when not to taste the mixture. One handbook advised, if your substance sings, do not harmonize, step away, take notes, possibly pray. There were also taxes. Successful alchemists were expected to contribute a portion of their profits to the crown. This led to a curious surge in public humility. Suddenly, practitioners who had once boasted of their near-divine skills began claiming their results were modest, erratic, or entirely theoretical. One alchemist wrote, "The process works in principle, but sadly not in practice, except on Thursdays, and only when I am not observed." As alchemy gained legal recognition, it also gained limits. Certain ingredients were restricted. Mercury could only be purchased in measured amounts. Nightshade required a license. Human hair, while not banned, raised questions. The use of ashes from religious texts was strongly discouraged. A few daring individuals continued to experiment with forbidden components, but they did so quietly and with good reason. Punishments varied. Fines were common, confiscations were routine. In rare cases, licenses were revoked. The most extreme incident involved an alchemist in Linz who created a powder that, when inhaled, caused nearby animals to dance. The result was a brief but memorable parade of livestock through the town square. He was placed under house arrest and forbidden from owning bells. Despite all this, many alchemists welcomed the structure. It gave them legitimacy. It separated them from charlatans who sold colored water and shouted about fire in the market square. It provided access to resources, recognition, and in some cases funding. Court-appointed alchemists received stipends, housing, and sometimes assistants who could read and count, an underrated luxury. Of course, the expectations grew with the titles. Once labeled as official, an alchemist was expected to deliver results. They were given problems to solve: how to purify spoiled wine, how to preserve meat without ice, how to identify poison without tasting it, how to make better glass, how to prevent gout, how to improve copper, how to stop bread from turning green. The requests were endless, and the deadlines were vague but insistent. Some of these problems were solvable, others were not. One unfortunate practitioner was tasked with sweetening seawater without diminishing its character. He died surrounded by barrels and notes that smelled strongly of licorice and despair. Another was asked to distill fear. He produced a translucent syrup that made people cry when touched and was never heard from again. There were even public demonstrations. These events were organized with varying levels of dignity. Some featured long speeches and meticulous displays. Others devolved into smoke, shouting, and mysterious stains. The audience was often a mix of nobles, scholars, and peasants, all equally eager to see something turn blue or explode. Reactions varied. One well-dressed woman fainted when a rose dipped in a solution began to glow. A butcher's apprentice clapped when a beaker cracked and hissed. A bishop walked out halfway through a lecture titled "The Mutable Soul and the Taming of Copper." Some alchemists thrived under scrutiny. They wore fine robes, gave clever interviews, and sent carefully prepared reports to their patrons. Others struggled, uncomfortable with being both artist and accountant. More than one disappeared into forests, cellars, or conveniently timed pilgrimages. But the system persisted. The combination of mysticism and bookkeeping proved unexpectedly durable. Even so, the core mystery remained. No matter how many forms were signed or ingredients weighed, alchemy could not be entirely tamed. Mixtures still misbehaved. Symbols still appeared unbidden. Recipes sometimes changed between readings. One scribe famously noted that the same instructions copied 5 times produced 5 different outcomes. The ink did not match, the paper smelled different, the results were unreadable. He blamed the moon. Attempts were made to standardize terminology. Lists were drafted, definitions were proposed, diagrams were copied and distributed, but symbols were notoriously slippery. What one man called the salt of harmony, another called the ash of longing. A spiral drawn clockwise was said to purify. Drawn counterclockwise, it summoned confusion. Some argued for numeric classification, others for color-based systems. The arguments themselves became alchemical, shifting, elaborate, and occasionally full of shouting. Meanwhile, forms multiplied. Inventories, certifications, incident logs. One particularly unfortunate alchemist was required to complete a 19-page report every time a vial cracked. Another was fined for omitting the humidity conditions of a failed tincture. Someone proposed a monthly audit of transmutational intent. That proposal mysteriously disappeared from the records, though a stain remains on the page. Still, there were benefits. Alchemists learned to protect themselves legally. Contracts were written. Lab accidents were classified as transmutational events. Spilled substances were logged as unintentional rearrangements of elemental character. Explosions became unforeseen accelerations of insight. These terms made it easier to remain in practice and to keep one's funding. What the bureaucracy offered was not control, but containment. It built a fence around the field and posted a sign that read, "Proceed, but report back." It tried to make the unknowable knowable through ink, wax seals, and ledgers. It succeeded only partially, which was enough to keep trying. In the end, alchemy and paperwork formed an uneasy alliance. One dealt in gold and dreams, the other in margins and stamps. Together, they marched forward, one foot in smoke, the other in parchment. Among the many figures who haunted the margins of alchemy were those who dressed like physicians but did not behave like them. They appeared at plague sites, battlefield edges, and smoky crossroads, half doctor, half mystic. Their masks were long-nosed and sealed, their coats were waxed, their boots creaked like arguments. But the strangest of these men was often not the one wearing the beak. It was the companion who walked beside him. He was never named. In the records, he is only referred to as the curious friend. He appeared in several accounts between 1547 and 1573, always near outbreaks, always silent. He carried a satchel full of vials, powders, and tightly wrapped bundles. He did not wear the full plague gear, no mask, no cane, just dark clothing, a wide hat, and gloves that never seemed to grow dirty. Wherever the plague doctor went, the friend followed. He never took notes, but he was always observing. He would crouch near the bodies, not in reverence or horror, but in focused study. He sometimes reached into mouths, scraped fingernails, or plucked eyelashes. He always wore gloves. The people who noticed him often assumed he was a servant or a gravedigger. But physicians remembered him. They wrote about him in private letters. One described him as too quiet to trust, too steady to ignore. His interest, it seemed, was not in the living. It was in the transition between life and not. Not the soul, not the disease, but the material in between. He collected samples, skin, hair, saliva, cloth pressed against the dying. On more than one occasion he was seen placing a small glass bead beneath a corpse's tongue. The purpose of this act remains unknown. He did not speak often, but when he did, his words were precise. What dissolves teaches more than what remains, he once told a physician in Leipzig. Another reported him murmuring, "Flesh sings, but only while failing." These were not the statements of a healer. They were the observations of someone cataloguing an unseen process, watching decay as though it were a language to be learned. Historians still debate whether he was an alchemist, an early chemist, or simply a very strange man with too much access. There is no record of him applying for guild membership. He published nothing. He signed no agreements. Yet his presence was consistent. In at least 9 separate plague diaries, he is described in the same way. Pale, deliberate, collecting things others had no desire to touch. A curious list survives in the personal notes of Dr. Johann Brücke of Salzburg. It is headed Items Acquired from Friend and includes small jar of powdered glass, 2 frogs, dried and flattened, thread with a single knot, teeth, unlabeled, vial marked dawn, 4th day, blood dried on vellum, at the bottom of the list, written more faintly. He smiled when I asked nothing. What he did with these materials is unknown. There is no surviving laboratory, no named successor, no formulas attributed to his hand. Some suggest he was working on a theory of bodily transience, the idea that matter changes not only by force, but by forgetting its shape. Others believe he sought to capture something that occurred only at the point of death, a residue of intent, or perhaps the last pattern of resistance before collapse. Whatever the purpose, he was not alone in his curiosity. Other alchemists, too, began to drift toward the threshold of medicine. They experimented with substances drawn from the sick and the dying. One created a tincture of fevered breath and claimed it caused dreams of fire. Another boiled cloth from a deathbed and wrote that the resulting vapor reached through thought. The ethical boundaries were flexible, consent was rare. Curiosity, however, was abundant. Some of these efforts were focused on protection. If death could be understood, perhaps it could be resisted. Recipes emerged for plague salves, protective inks, and wearable amulets made from crushed garnet and soot. One manuscript describes a necklace that hums when illness is near. Another offers instructions for a wax seal that, when pressed against a window pane, fogs only when the room is clean. None of these claims were verified. Most were quietly forgotten. But others pursued more invasive goals: preservation, reanimation, a reversal of decline. One alchemist operating near Gdansk reportedly injected a fluid made from copper salts and vinegar into the heart of a newly dead man. The body sat up, opened its eyes, and then disintegrated into ash. The event was witnessed by 2 apprentices and one very traumatized baker who insisted that the corpse smiled just before vanishing. These incidents were rare, but they were not isolated. Letters exchanged between practitioners hint at a shared belief that the moment of death is not an end but a doorway, and like any doorway, it might be left ajar. They theorized that something lingers in the body, measurable but undefined. They spoke of resonant heat, inverse memory, and the final flavor. They wrote equations that included time, sorrow, and silence. One document, retrieved from a burn chapel in Lower Saxony, described an experiment involving death's proximity. The alchemist reportedly sat beside the ill, taking measurements of light distortion near their fingers. When questioned, he said he was searching for departure lines. No explanation was offered. The document ends with a single line: "They fade before they leave." In this context, the curious friend takes on a different meaning. Perhaps he was not a researcher, but a collector. Perhaps he was harvesting patterns that others ignored. One particularly unsettling account describes him dipping a brush into the tears of a grieving widow and painting a circle on the floor. What happened next is lost. The record ends abruptly. Others claim to have met him. Not many. One surviving letter from a nun in Brabant describes a visitor during the Great Fever who asked to sit beside each dying patient, saying nothing writing, and nothing, only leaving behind small, folded squares of paper with a single word. Inside, change. Wait. Once. Mirror. She burned them after the fever passed. No burial was ever recorded for him. no grave discovered, but his influence persisted. In later alchemical texts, strange annotations appear, always in the margins, always unsigned. A diagram of a tooth split into quarters. A note beside a boiling procedure. Do not stir while remembering. A sketch of a hand reaching into a mirror. These fragments are attributed to the one who listens beneath. What remains is speculation. Was he a failed physician, a former monk, an alchemist who went so far into study that he fell out of profession entirely? No one knows, but the artifacts he left behind, the vials, the jars, the lists, suggest a mind that viewed death not as a problem but as a process, something to be witnessed, recorded, and perhaps someday reversed. In the lore of street alchemists, his name is still whispered, not as a curse, but as a warning. Not all knowledge grants control. Some only offers understanding, and even that may arrive too late. They say he still appears in places where endings gather, at hospital thresholds, at the edges of battlefields, once, supposedly, in the reflection of a scholar's glasses as he died mid-sentence. He is not a ghost, he is not an omen, he is something else, curious, always watching, waiting for the next transformation to begin. There was a particular kind of failure that alchemists grew to cherish, not the catastrophic kind, though explosions did have their charm, but the noble kind, the ones that hissed, bubbled, or dissolved into ash with elegance. These were failures that felt close to discovery, like the world had almost agreed to change its rules before pulling away at the last moment. The records of these moments read less like science and more like theatre reviews. Workbenches were cluttered with the remains of these noble errors, beakers clouded with periwinkle residue, crucibles stained with stubborn red glazes, scrolls with annotations that trailed into ellipses. It was said that a seasoned alchemist could read the failure marks in glass like a scribe reads a confession. A crack to the right meant heat imbalance. A twist in the neck suggested spiritual resistance. An implosion with no visible cause was simply filed under mood. One of the more spectacular examples of such glorious failure comes from a cellar in Timisoara, where an alchemist known only as Elias attempted to create transcendent matter, a substance that would not obey weight. His mixture included wax, lead, violet oil, and something labeled lucid salt. He heated it slowly, chanting a rhyme of his own invention. The result did not float. It exploded into dust and reassembled into a shape that resembled a dandelion made of stone. It collapsed 10 seconds later. Elias wept with joy and recorded it as progress beautifully undone. These moments were not rare. Alchemists often described their greatest breakthroughs as moments of almost. A flash of light with no cause, a shift in scent from acid to almond, a mixture that darkened to perfect black and then returned to clear. Each one was noted, dated, and usually failed to repeat. Some suspected these anomalies were tests from the universe. Others believed they were results that came too early and slipped back into non-existence. There was an alchemist in Erfurt who specialized in failed elixirs. He kept shelves of them, each labeled with what it was meant to do and what it actually did. One was meant to cure headaches, but induced elaborate dreams of climbing furniture. Another was meant to soothe anger, but instead turned the drinker's voice into a whisper for 3 days. His favorite was a syrup intended to enhance memory. It caused a single vivid recollection of a childhood storm and then nothing else for hours. A success, he wrote, if measured differently. These misfires often birthed unexpected disciplines. A failed attempt to purify coal led to the accidental creation of smokeless ink. A broken jar of fermented rose resin was found to repel moths with surprising efficiency. One alchemist, trying to brew liquid clarity, spilled the mixture on linen and invented a method for translucent dyes. These moments were not planned. They were not catalogued by formula, but they were kept, remembered, and sometimes replicated by accident again. Some alchemists made careers from failing publicly. They performed in squares, mixing improbable substances and narrating their misjudgments with dramatic flair. Audiences gathered not to see success, but to witness the limits of possibility. One such performer in Olomouc lit mixtures that changed color as they boiled, ending in fountains of steam and a smell described as pine, regret, and wedding cake. He wore silver gloves and never explained anything. This celebration of failure baffled outsiders. Scholars dismissed it as unscientific. Priests viewed it as wasteful. Merchants considered it terrible business. But for alchemists, it was a form of dialogue. They were asking questions with fire and listening to answers written in melted wax and vapor. When things went wrong, spectacularly wrong, it meant the world had responded, and that, they believed, was worth everything. There was a ritual among certain guilds called the burning shelf. Once a year, practitioners would gather and burn the formulas that had most stubbornly refused to cooperate. The ashes were collected and stored in glass urns, labeled only with the phrase, "in case we were wrong." These urns were passed down to apprentices as reminders. Every failed attempt had once been a dream worth chasing. Apprentices, in particular, learned through collapse. They were given tasks that would almost certainly fail, not as punishment, but as calibration. One common exercise involved trying to extract oil from stone fruit using only cold tools and silence. Another required them to brew a potion that could unspoil milk. No one succeeded. The point was not to win, but to listen, to watch what happened when the world refused to comply. Some went further. They developed systems to grade their own failures. A fizz was worth 1 point. A silent curdle, 3. If the mixture changed color and refused to return, that was 5. Accidental transparency, 7. If it smelled like an emotion, 10. If it hummed without boiling, the experiment was immediately sealed, blessed, and hidden. Not all rules were strict, but the sense of wonder remained constant. Failure also served as a kind of self-portrait. The errors revealed the hands that made them. Some alchemists favored fire and always scorched their mixtures. Others could not help but overcomplicate. One practitioner was known for adding a final drop of something unnecessary just before each test. "That drop," he claimed, "is where I live." Of course, not all failures were safe. There were mixtures that stained the walls for decades. One blend, intended to summon calm, caused wooden beams to bend toward the floor. Another briefly reversed gravity for small objects before returning everything with force. These were not celebrated, they were feared. But even then, some part of the alchemist took notes and whispered, "Interesting." The culture of failure produced its own language. Phrases like, "it almost held," or "it remembered the shape," appeared frequently in journals. Some wrote, "the mixture sighed," or "the light hesitated." These were not metaphors, they were honest attempts to capture phenomena that did not belong on scales or charts. The world, when pushed, sometimes pushed back in poetry. Perhaps the most haunting example is the case of Helena Thorne, an alchemist in Utrecht, who spent 20 years attempting to distill quiet. Her lab was lined with wool and moss to absorb sound. Her materials included snowmelt, shadow water, and ash from unread books. Each attempt failed. Some produced silence, but not stillness. Others made the room feel hollow, but the wind still knocked. She never succeeded. But when she died, her journals were found to contain no ink. The pages were blank, but when turned, each one made a different tone. Notes like a musical scale played on paper. No one could replicate it. In the end, alchemists did not fear failure. They invited it, they studied it, they built their tables with drawers labeled for it. Because in those moments when the mixture collapsed, when the formula forgot itself, when the world shrugged off expectation, something clearer could emerge. Not the product, but the practitioner. Not the gold, but the reach. And every so often, just beneath the surface of a failed result, something shimmered, too faint to name, too brief to capture, but undeniably there. A whisper of transformation, a nod from the unknown. Alchemy, for all its glass and flame, was just as much a matter of ink. The alchemists who shaped its history did not simply mix and boil, they wrote. They documented every trial, every suspicion, every glimmer of success, and every unexplainable event. Shelves groaned under the weight of hand-bound volumes, margins filled with frantic annotations, and loose parchment scattered like autumn leaves on stone floors. These were not books of answers, they were books of questions whispered to time. The journals of alchemists were rarely tidy. Ink was often smudged, diagrams were uneven. One page might contain a recipe, the next a confession, and the third a prayer disguised as an observation. They wrote not to impress, but to remember, to capture the moment when lead almost shimmered like gold, or when a mixture turned violet for no reason, and stayed that way, stubbornly beautiful, until it evaporated in silence. Some alchemists wrote for themselves alone, others wrote for students they had not yet met. A few wrote to future versions of themselves, convinced that what made no sense today might become clear if read with older eyes. There are letters addressed to the me who understands, or my wiser shadow, or simply you when it is quiet. A notable example is the Codex of Repeating Ash, found in the ruins of a monastery outside Plzeň. It contains over 300 pages of tight script, all variations on the same 3 processes, each slightly altered, each one failing. The margins, however, are filled with poetry, lines that begin with formulas and end with images of snow falling upward or fire dreaming of rivers. Historians still argue whether the Codex was a practical document or a symbolic meditation. Many believe it was both. Writing became its own form of ritual. Pens were chosen carefully. Ink was mixed from lampblack, wine sediment, or the juice of specific berries picked at moonrise. Some alchemists refused to write unless the weather was calm. Others believed certain days were better for clarity, Wednesdays for purity, Fridays for reversal. There were even those who scented their pages not for pleasure, but to influence the mood of the ink. The symbols used were often deeply personal. A triangle might mean fire to one, but transformation to another. Some symbols changed meaning depending on where they were drawn. A spiral in the upper margin denoted success. The same spiral in the lower margin meant disappointment. Circles drawn clockwise invoked intention, counterclockwise, surrender. It was less a language and more a set of habits turned holy. Decoding these books remains a challenge. Translators must learn not only the writer's preferred alphabet, but also their humor, their fears, and their handwriting when frustrated. One alchemist wrote clearly only when uncertain. Another used a separate ink for anything that had failed twice. Some used codes that changed mid-page. A few invented entirely new scripts and then forgot how to read them. And yet within these pages, certain patterns emerge. The language of weight and heat. The record of how a substance responds when pressed or spoken to. A list of colors seen only in mixtures that no longer exist. There are whispers of consistencies. What time of night produces the gentlest reactions? What phase of the moon makes Mercury hold its shape longer? These fragments, while rarely definitive, create a mosaic of intention, a glimpse into how alchemists thought, felt, and searched. One particularly strange document, referred to simply as the Grimoire of the Absent Line, contains only unfinished sentences. Hundreds of them, When the fire turned green, and the ash settled like. And had I waited another hour, perhaps. No explanations, no drawings. Some believe the book was cursed, designed to prevent closure. Others believe it was a confession, an attempt to preserve the feeling of almost. A reverence for the incomplete. Even more cryptic are the journals that include interactions not with materials, but with ideas. One alchemist wrote entire dialogues with a concept he called the hum of gold. He described it as a presence that advised, rebuked, and occasionally sulked. He never claimed to have heard a voice, only that when he held certain mixtures near his chest, he could feel what he called argument in the lungs. Another wrote nightly letters to the Philosopher's Stone, addressed Dear Stone, ending each one with yours in failing light. These writings often blurred the line between method and myth. A single page might include instructions for refining vinegar, followed by a meditation on patience, a diagram of a fish made of fire, and a line that simply read, "Salt remembers more than it tells." These were not distractions. They were reflections of the alchemical mindset, where transformation of matter was always paired with transformation of the self. Many alchemists believed that to work with substances properly, one had to change alongside them. As mixtures clarified, so too should thought. As metals were reduced to their purest form, so too should the ego dissolve. Writing was the mirror held to this process. The act of setting ink to paper made the invisible visible. It gave shape to uncertainty, turned intuition into artifact. Because of this, the journals became sacred. They were buried with their owners, hidden in walls, sealed in jars. One was wrapped in lead and left beneath a river. Another was sewn into the lining of a robe. Some were never meant to be found. Others were placed in obvious locations, as if daring someone to read and misunderstand. Occasionally, these books spoke to each other. An alchemist in Lyon copied recipes from one found in Krakow, but corrected them with sarcasm. "No, Laszlo," he wrote, "gold does not laugh unless you burn the wine too long." Another kept a ledger of dreams, inspired by a scroll he never fully translated. The entries become stranger over time. Spoke with a jar, it disagreed, must adjust pepper. And later, 2 suns this morning, only one outside. Some of these texts were works of art, illuminated borders, gilded diagrams, watermarks in the shape of feathers or flames. These embellishments were not decorative, they were reminders that the work was beautiful even when incomplete, that the search itself deserved color and care. And there were mistakes. Pages burned, smeared, ripped, margins that held only curses or the single word "why" repeated down the page. These scars mattered as much as the successes. They showed the effort, the doubt, the humanity behind the symbols. They whispered, "I was here, I tried." Perhaps the most poignant entry found in any of these books is unsigned, written in a tight, angular hand near the end of a volume otherwise filled with formulas. It reads, "The substance is almost ready, but I am no longer the one who asked for it." There is no follow-up, only blank pages. Alchemy, in the end, was never only about results. It was a conversation with the unknown, conducted in flame, smoke, and ink. The journals were its voice, quiet, persistent, often illegible. But they endure, waiting on shelves, whispering their failures, hoping to be read not as manuals, but as mirrors. Among the lesser-known pursuits in alchemical tradition was the attempt to alter perception, not just of the world, but of time itself. While many practitioners sought to change metals or discover the essence of life, there were those who believed that transformation was most powerful when it began in the mind. These alchemists were concerned not with what was visible, but with what could be felt between seconds. They brewed tinctures meant to stretch moments, compress memory, and bend attention into strange shapes. This branch of alchemy, sometimes called chronognosis, dealt not with hours and minutes, but with the felt sense of passing. Practitioners believed that time was a property that could be distilled, stored, and even manipulated, given the correct ingredients, atmosphere, and intent. Their laboratories resembled meditation chambers more than workshops: dark walls, suspended bells, slow-burning incense. Experiments were measured not by weight or color, but by what the alchemist experienced while watching wax melt. One technique, described in the Treatise of Lingering Seconds, involved placing a copper bowl of water in sunlight and watching the reflections until they slowed. The alchemist would then drink a tea made from crushed anemone petals and steeped rain. If done correctly, the world would begin to soften. Objects would seem to breathe. Thoughts would arrive gently, as though walking rather than rushing. Writing produced during this state is often loopy, uneven, and filled with phrases like "felt the room pause" and "heard the tick before the tock." A more controversial method required the isolation of sleep. Alchemists would restrict their rest to 2 hours per day, forcing their minds into a permanent state of near dream. In this condition, they claimed to receive insights from the space between alertness and surrender. Some wrote entire essays on the stretch of a candle's flicker. Others described seeing figures move at speeds too slow to be perceived normally, as if reality had chosen a different tempo just for them. Not all attempts were gentle. A practitioner in Regensburg attempted to freeze intention by sitting in a bath of rose salt while reciting a reversed version of a psalm. The process reportedly took 3 hours. At the end, she believed only 5 minutes had passed. Her journal ends mid-sentence. Another alchemist used mirrors angled toward each other to create a tunnel of reflection, then placed a small clock inside. After several hours, he claimed that the ticking no longer matched external time. Whether this was illusion or success remains unknown. Some chronognostic alchemists believed time was a fluid that thickened in grief and thinned in joy. One recipe, Elixir of Patient Hours, combined elderflower, rust, and burnt feathers. It was said to make waiting feel pleasant. Another formula, Draught of the Fifth Bell, was brewed to hasten long conversations. Its drinkers described a strange sense of moving forward while standing still. Several manuscripts warn that prolonged use led to confusion about sequence, memories arriving out of order, or feelings preceding the events that caused them. One preserved document, the Scroll of Woven Days, offers a table for tracking emotional time. Each row lists a standard hour and the accompanying emotional hour, how long that hour felt during different states. For example, noon after loss, 96 minutes, twilight during hope, 32 minutes, rain during contentment, 57 minutes, argument at dawn, immeasurable. These calculations were not precise, they were reflective, a means to study the inner clock that no bell tower could announce. There were tools as well: sand that fell slower in the presence of certain chants, pendulums that reversed under specific conditions. One device made of bone and silver wire was said to chime only when no one was looking. Its creator claimed that attention itself disrupted time's natural rhythm. To prove it, he left the room and returned to find the chime still vibrating. No one else heard it. Alchemists who pursued this path were often regarded with suspicion. Their results were difficult to verify. Their journals read more like dreams than records. But they believed deeply that the flow of time could be engaged with, shaped, maybe even healed. They spoke of moments that had become knotted and needed unwinding. They believed certain hours left bruises on the soul, and that careful observation could locate and soothe them. This belief extended beyond personal experience. Some thought places could carry temporal residue. A cellar where sorrow had lingered might slow time for anyone who entered. A field where joy had been felt repeatedly might make minutes pass in a blink. Alchemists visited such places, set their watches, and waited. The data was often inconsistent, but the feeling, they insisted, was real. An alchemist in Venice recorded a process he called time alignment. It involved standing at sunset with bare feet in river mud, holding a quartz sphere, and breathing in rhythm with a metronome carved from cedar. He did this every evening for a year. His journal contains no conclusions, only a statement near the end. My thoughts no longer arrive in the wrong order. I meet them now where they begin. These practices did not always go unnoticed. The Church frowned upon any suggestion that time could be shaped by will. Time belonged to the divine. The hourglass was sacred. Attempts to alter perception were viewed as prideful, possibly heretical. Several alchemists were questioned, though few were charged. Their work was dismissed as eccentric and ineffective, safe only because it seemed to lead nowhere tangible. But others watched more closely. Letters between noble patrons hint at curiosity. Could time perception be used for diplomacy, for interrogation, for managing labor? A few alchemists were discreetly employed to study these questions. Their reports are classified or lost, but one letter survives, reading only, "The oil worked. He believed the hour had passed. It had been 10 minutes. Proceed." For most, however, the work remained personal, a search not for advantage, but for understanding. What made a moment feel endless? Why did some memories last longer than the events that birthed them? Could time be tasted, weighed, heard? Could it perhaps be sung? One document, the Lament of the Unmeasured Clock, includes a series of chants meant to draw time closer. Each chant is paired with a posture and a scent. Instructions are vague. The final note reads, "If you begin to cry, continue. Time is listening." And perhaps that is what chronognostic alchemy was really about, not control, but intimacy. A desire to hold time gently, to ask it questions no sundial would understand, to say, "Stay a little longer," or "Go, you have done enough." To treat minutes not as units, but as visitors. The mixtures brewed for these experiments rarely survived. Most evaporated. Some curdled in moonlight. A few left stains that shifted each morning. But the journals remain, filled with clocks that point inward, recipes that feel like prayers, and diagrams of spirals drawn so slowly the ink changed color as it dried. Alchemy did not change the flow of time, but it changed how alchemists listened to it, and that perhaps was transformation enough. Beneath the formal study of elements and celestial influence, there thrived a subtler branch of alchemy, the alchemy of language. Practitioners who studied it did not always speak of it openly. They believed that words themselves were substances, volatile, potent, and capable of transformation. Their aim was not to change lead into gold, but to change silence into meaning or confusion into clarity, using only ink, breath, and voice. These were the word workers. Their laboratories were libraries. Their tools were quills, ash dust ink, and sheets of treated lambskin that creaked when bent. Their crucibles were metaphors. They practiced the shaping of names, the distillation of riddles, the sharpening of questions until they rang like bells when spoken aloud. Some claimed that if the right phrase were ever written, the world itself would shudder slightly, as if recognizing its reflection for the first time. This belief was not without precedent. Certain alchemists had long known that diagrams drawn with intention could influence outcome. Circles and triangles were more than geometry. They were invitations, so too were words. One phrase placed in the margin of a recipe might calm an otherwise aggressive mixture. A single line whispered during a failed transmutation might draw the color back to life. There were phrases meant to cool, to summon, to soothe, to bind. The oldest examples are found in margins, small clusters of words repeated like spells. Wait gently, open with sorrow, turn before thinking. These were not instructions in the traditional sense. They were emotional reagents, context binders. They shaped the mood in which the work unfolded. Some recipes would not function unless accompanied by a spoken line. Others required silence until the final drop. An alchemist named Bertram of Mainz believed words held mass. He conducted a series of experiments involving parchment weighed before and after writing. The changes were negligible, yet consistent. He concluded that language, when shaped with intent, pressed lightly on the world. His theory was never widely accepted, but his records were meticulous, and the margins of his books are filled with miniature symbols for weight and whisper. Others believed that words possessed heat, that certain vowels could warm a solution, or that consonants spoken in rhythm could increase volatility. One practitioner claimed that reading a stanza aloud over Mercury made it shimmer differently. Another insisted that combining specific poetic meters with certain ingredients reduced bitterness in elixirs. Rhyme, he wrote, is a spoon for difficult truths. There were those who worked exclusively in letters. They crafted charms composed entirely of language, no herbs, no powders, only ink. These were folded into triangles, sewn into cloth, or burned beside a mixture as it cooled. Their phrasing was precise. One charm read, "Do not become what you are before." Another, "Return only what you have taken." The charms were often used to stabilize experimental states of mind or to redirect reactions that showed signs of distortion. In the city of Graz, a group of scribes experimented with phonetic alchemy, the shaping of effect through spoken syllables. Their work focused on resonance. Certain sounds, they believed, could open or close pathways in thought and matter. They mapped vocal patterns onto mixtures, trying to discover whether chanting in unison changed outcome. The results were inconsistent, but many agreed that the air felt different afterward, as though something had been noticed and chose not to stay. The most ambitious among them aimed to write the world as it was. This was not metaphor. These alchemists believed that reality could be recorded so accurately, with such depth and honesty, that the act of reading it aloud would recreate it. They spoke of the true record, a text that described fire so well it burned, or pain so precisely that it soothed. They searched for the perfect sentence, one that could hold sorrow without breaking. None claimed to have found it, but several vanished during the search. Their books remain, often thin volumes hand-bound with titles like Throat of Iron or The Grammar of Fog. Inside, pages filled with lines that loop and bend, as though the ink had a will of its own. Some sentences are crossed out violently. Others are circled, underlined, annotated with small arrows and notes such as "breathe too early" or "still too sharp." These alchemists developed their own terminology. A word that caused a mixture to settle was called a softener. One that made it rise was a lift. An ambiguous term used too often was a ghost. They debated the ethics of metaphor. Some insisted that to describe a substance as angry shaped its outcome. Others countered that it only shaped the alchemist. Neither side could agree, but they all recorded the argument in their journals. A few created languages of their own, private dialects composed of invented syllables, shapes, and gestures. These were used for internal clarity, to describe phenomena that ordinary language could not handle. They claimed that traditional words carried baggage, that calling something failure marked it permanently. Their languages had no term for error, only unfinished or awaiting shape. One such system, known as the Thorn script, appears in 4 surviving manuscripts, all of which are still being deciphered. What has been translated so far includes lines like "Speak slowly, so the metal listens," and "Do not write to impress, write to remember." Some records speak of linguistic contagion, phrases that once read could not be forgotten, words that echoed long after the book was closed. A scroll discovered in the ruins of a study outside Dresden was wrapped in lead and sealed with beeswax. The warning etched into the case read, "These words are tired of being read, let them sleep." The scroll has never been opened, or perhaps it has, and the reader was changed too deeply to report. Not all practitioners pursued depth. Some played. They wrote riddles into formulas, turned recipes into limericks, or scribbled jokes in the corners of grim pages. One particularly joyful alchemist filled her notebook with puns about acids, claiming that laughter increased solubility. Her critics disagreed. Her results, however, were unusually consistent. Through all of this, the central belief remained that words could alter the path of change. That language, shaped with care, did more than describe the world. It participated in it. Alchemists treated their notebooks as laboratories, their tongues as tools, their silences as statements. In the end, the alchemy of language did not yield immortality or gold, but it created something stranger. Sentences that held breath, ink that remembered emotion, and symbols that could make a reader pause and feel a room shift slightly around them. And perhaps that was the point. Not to build a world from scratch, but to name the one already shimmering just beyond understanding. Not to control fire, but to say, with exacting honesty, here is how it felt to burn. There existed, in every generation, alchemists who veered from consensus, not out of rebellion, but because consensus simply did not interest them. These were the solitary theorists, the midnight sketchers, the ones who rarely completed anything, but whose notes filled entire trunks. Their peers often found them frustrating. They would begin with great declarations, promise breakthroughs, and vanish into thought for months, only to emerge with riddles, smudged papers, and eyes that blinked as though adjusting to existence. They were the theorists of impossible substances. Each of them had a name for it. The forgotten element, the zero substance, the eclipsed one. They believed that something was missing from the known world, not hidden, but simply overlooked. Not lead, gold, salt, or sulfur, but something else entirely, something foundational. They did not agree on what it was, they only agreed that it had to exist. Some said it was the matter that held other matter together, that without it transmutation was simply mimicry, not truth. Others believed it was a non-material presence, a quality, not a thing. Stillness that could be distilled, faith that could be weighed. They looked for it in smoke trails, in shadows beneath boiling flasks, in the slight delay between flame and color. They measured the space between reactions and called it substance. One alchemist, writing in a garret in Innsbruck, insisted that the missing element was neither material nor spiritual, but narrative. He believed that each substance carried a story, and that real change could only happen when one story was fully told and another allowed to begin. His mixtures often included pages torn from books, steeped in wine and burned beside the ingredients. His journal is filled with phrases like, "The copper refuses the ending, and let the ash speak first." Another theorist maintained that the key to transformation was not temperature or timing, but mood. She catalogued her own emotional state before each experiment: hope, boredom, regret, laughter. She claimed that only when she felt entirely neutral, neither yearning nor distracted, did the mixtures behave. Her final note reads, "No substance changes while being watched with desire." The search for the impossible substance produced wild methodologies. One practitioner built a scale so sensitive it reacted to breath. He used it to weigh intentions, placing a blank slip of parchment on one side and his handwritten goal on the other. He claimed that if the scale dipped, the intention was sincere. If it stayed level, the experiment was to be postponed. He wrote, "Honesty has weight, lies have stillness." A circle of alchemists in Sigishora attempted to extract presence itself. They brewed liquids that could not be described, only experienced. Witnesses reported mixtures that caused the air to bend slightly, or that made sound arrive slower, as if it had forgotten where to go. None of these effects could be replicated. The group disbanded after one of them claimed to have distilled the feeling of being watched. He sealed the vial and buried it under stone. Theorists often worked in symbols. They drew spirals inside triangles, set against grids of numbers that meant nothing to anyone else. One alchemist believed that by drawing a symbol slowly enough, he could catch the moment when it ceased to be line and became meaning. He never succeeded, but his sketchbooks remain, filled with pages where a single curve has been redrawn 100 times, each one slightly altered, like a thought trying to remember itself. Others turned to sound. They believed the missing element responded only to resonance. Tuning forks were struck beside beakers. Notes were sung into mixtures. One alchemist conducted experiments using the ringing of cathedral bells, tracking how liquids responded to the shift in tone between the third and seventh chime. He noted that silence between tolls was more powerful than sound. "The echo remembers," he wrote, "even when the tone is gone." Still others focused not on material at all, but on questions. One theorist filled hundreds of pages with unanswered inquiries, not because he lacked conclusions, but because he believed answers obscured what the world was still trying to ask. He wrote, "What does silver believe it is protecting? Why does heat look like forgiveness?" His notes are difficult to decipher, not because of encryption, but because they make no attempt to explain themselves. They simply wait. These ideas were not widely adopted. They lacked replication, coherence, and frequently results. But they persisted. Because behind the charts and formulas, many alchemists carried the suspicion that something essential had slipped through the cracks, that their materials were faithful but incomplete, that there was one more layer, not deeper but subtler, not harder to reach but easier to overlook. And so the theorists kept writing. They wrote about thresholds, the moment before a reaction, the space between heating and boil. They wrote about memory, how some mixtures seemed to behave better the second time, as if they remembered the process. They questioned whether lead truly wished to become gold, or whether the alchemist was imposing a narrative that did not belong. They debated the morality of forcing change. One manuscript discovered in a locked cabinet behind a crumbling abbey contains a section titled "The Ethics of Transmutation." It reads, "To change is not always to improve. To purify may be to erase. Before asking a substance to become something else, ask if you have become what you intended." Such writings were not popular. They were contemplative, slow, and offered no shortcuts to riches, but they endured. Copied by hand, whispered between students, passed like soft questions down the generations. Some theorists never sought to name the missing element. They were content to chase it, like a mirage that sharpened the mind even as it slipped away. They believed the pursuit itself changed the practitioner. That to try and fail and try again was not wasted effort, but a kind of alchemy in its own right, not of substance, but of the seeker. Others refused to admit failure. They claimed they had found the element, but that it was invisible, that it could not be shown, only described. One alchemist wrote an entire book without ever naming a single material. The pages are filled with reflections on balance, patience, and the difference between longing and greed. It ends with a line written in larger script. The gold was never gold. It was the moment before. These ideas never changed the official guild practices. They did not produce marketable potions. They rarely led to promotion or patronage. But they kept showing up in margins, footnotes, whispered discussions after midnight. Because even the most practical alchemist, when faced with an experiment that behaved too well or failed too elegantly, could not help but wonder if something else had intervened, something unnamed. There is one final tale preserved in fragments. It speaks of an alchemist who built no laboratory, kept no mixtures, and collected no substances. Instead, he sat in the same spot for 40 years, observing wind, watching leaves fall, and listening to bells. He taught no students. He sold nothing. Yet visitors came from across the region, simply to sit beside him. They said the air was different there, that it clarified their thoughts, that for a few moments everything made sense, and then did not, but gently. No one remembers his name. His notes, if any existed, are lost. But someone carved his likeness into a block of soft stone and placed it in a niche above a city gate. The plaque beneath it reads, "He waited until the question arrived." That is what the theorists believed in, not answers, not fame, not the gold that glitters, but the gold that flickers in the mind when the world pauses for just a breath. They searched for that flicker, and if they never found it, they still learned to see in the dark. Toward the dimming edges of the 16th century, alchemy began to shift. The world around it hardened, laboratories became cleaner, books more rigid. The language of transformation slowly gave way to the language of measurement. Scales replaced symbols, procedures replaced riddles, certainty, or the illusion of it, replaced wonder. And yet, even as modern science prepared to claim the mantle of reason, the attics remained. Quiet, candlelit spaces where the air still carried traces of incense, vinegar, ash, and longing. Within these spaces the old ways persisted, not out of stubbornness, but out of reverence, not because they worked in the traditional sense, but because they continued to ask questions no one else remembered how to ask. There were still mixtures brewed without purpose, only curiosity. Still, diagrams drawn on parchment in the middle of the night, unaccompanied by explanation. Still flasks sealed not for study, but for silence. These final alchemists did not expect to change the world. They only hoped to understand why they had once wanted to. One such figure was Lucette of Moravia. Her journals, discovered decades later behind a loose hearthstone, contain no formulas, only observations, descriptions of the way light moved through fog, lists of dreams she could not forget, notes on how different kinds of silence tasted, chalk, moss, dusk. She wrote, "I no longer seek the stone, I seek the moment before I ever believed I needed it." Lucette recorded what she called still reactions, mixtures that produced nothing but stillness. She claimed they were her most powerful. She would brew them slowly in the late hours, then sit beside them as they settled, not to observe change, but to witness refusal. "It holds," she wrote once, "and so do I." Around the same time, another alchemist in Bruges attempted to measure forgetting. He burned one page each morning from his previous journals, noting how the loss felt in the mind and in the hand. His last surviving entry reads, "The gaps are beautiful. I no longer fear them." He vanished soon after. His name does not survive, only a symbol etched onto the floor of his chamber, a circle open on one side as if inviting the rest of the world in. There were others, scattered across cities and hills, practicing without witnesses. An old man in Lyon who believed smoke could carry memories, a widow in Pest who sang to jars and labeled each one with the name of a vanished feeling, a boy in Danzig who claimed he could change the taste of water by holding his breath and thinking of feathers. No one verified their results. No one needed to. They did not document to impress. Their notes were often incomplete, the ink uneven, the thoughts trailing into the margins. But their words were not careless. They were tender. They were written as if the paper itself might sigh. They knew they would not be understood, and so they wrote with honesty instead of precision. By this time, the guilds had grown quieter. Fewer apprentices arrived. The recipes grew more technical, the language colder. Alchemy began to resemble chemistry. This was not a betrayal, it was a transformation. And alchemists, if nothing else, understood what transformation meant. They let the process unfold. They stepped back. Some, however, continued to walk the line between the old and the new. They wore robes beneath their coats. They added whispers to their weighings. They logged their findings in ledgers, then wrote poems about the failures in hidden journals. One man reportedly sent 2 versions of each report to his patron, one with the expected numbers, the other with metaphor. "Choose as you wish," he wrote. "Both are true." There was a final council once, convened unofficially, in a disused chapel at the edge of Vienna. 6 alchemists gathered, some well known, others only names in notebook. They did not meet to draft doctrine. They met to say farewell. They spoke of mistakes, of quiet successes, of things they had seen that science could not yet name. One, an elderly woman with trembling hands, said, "We were never wrong, we were just early." They burned no scrolls that night. They sealed no chambers. They simply passed around a flask of clear water, each taking one sip, then speaking a word they wished to preserve. Not a term of power, but of value. One said patience, one said curve, one said before. These were recorded nowhere, but the room, it was said, held them. Even the final books of the era carried traces of the dream. In between chapters on distillation and mineral classification, one might find an annotated diagram shaped like a heartbeat, or a margin note that read, "The solution smiled." I did not trust it. These were the last embers, still warm, still glowing. Then, slowly, the fires cooled. The attics emptied, the language changed. Alchemy became what it is now remembered to be. A prelude, a promise unkept, a dream overwritten by glassware and grant funding. The popular story ends there. But that is not quite the truth, because even now, in rooms not yet emptied, on shelves too high to reach, the books remain, the flasks remain, the symbols drawn in haste and hope remain. Every mixture that failed still left behind its scent. Every diagram unfinished still holds potential. Every question written down still waits to be asked again. Alchemy was never only about gold. It was about the longing to become, to change, to understand. It was a mirror held to the self and to the world, asking, gently, persistently, what else might be possible. It was a craft of humility, of trying, of listening, of failure so beautiful it became sacred. Some say the last true alchemist was a child in the Black Forest who melted snow in a copper bowl and believed he had created water. Others say it was a woman in Naples who smiled when her elixir turned blue, then poured it into the sea and never explained why. Perhaps they are both true, perhaps the work never ended, it only grew quieter. Somewhere, right now, someone is holding a glass of tea to the light, watching the way it glows. Someone is stirring soup and noticing how it thickens like memory. Someone is rearranging books on a shelf and feeling that they have just aligned something that matters, though they cannot say what. Alchemy did not disappear. It dissolved into daily life, into candles lit with intention, into words spoken carefully, as if they mattered. Into the pause before speaking. The breath held before a decision. The way we sometimes stare at his spoon and feel like it almost understands. And so the alchemist persists, not as a profession, but as a pattern, as the part of you that wonders why the same rain sounds different some nights, as the part of you that keeps old notebooks and occasionally rereads them without knowing what you are looking for. You do not need gold, you only need wonder and a quiet room, and the willingness to ask a question with no promise of an answer. That is enough. That was always enough. And now, with the final story told, let us begin to leave the world behind. The flames have long since faded. The last ember in the hearth glows faintly, not to light the room, but simply to remind it that warmth once lived here. The air has settled. No more bubbling mixtures, no chalk dust rising, just the stillness that follows when hands go quiet and the mind agrees not to chase. There is no need to think of elements anymore, no metals to change, no stones to grind. The vials rest where they were left, perfectly content to remain unanswered. The pages of the journal lie open to a page with no ink, no symbols, just space, soft, wide, forgiving space. Perhaps something stirred in you tonight, a question, a memory, a corner of thought that flickered gently and refused to fade. Let it remain unspoken. You do not need to name it, not now, not here. There are no instructions in this part of the journey, nothing to decipher, nothing to complete. This is the moment after the door has closed and before anything else begins. It is a rare place, one not measured in hours or distance, but in stillness. You are there now. Around you, the night folds in gently. The walls exhale. The roof hums faintly with the quiet rhythm of settled wood. Outside, wind brushes past leaves with no urgency, no sound beyond that slow hush you can only hear when the rest of the world has finally quieted. Even time, ever faithful in its passing, has chosen to move more softly now. The minutes arrive like feathers. The seconds drift like moths in warm dusk. You are safe here. Safe to breathe slowly without direction. Safe to be weightless in the dark, like steam that does not rise but lingers. Safe to let go of the story you were telling yourself before the story told you something new. If there are echoes, let them echo. If there are unfinished questions, let them rest in their incompleteness. They are not lost. They are only waiting for sleep to fold them into new shape. Imagine this moment stretching gently outward, like ripples across a silver surface. Nothing breaks, nothing fades, only widening, only softening, only stillness. Somewhere, far from here, there are others who once watched their candles flicker low, who held a flask in trembling hands and whispered not a spell, but a hope. They too are sleeping now, their questions unanswered, their symbols rubbed away by time and by touch. But their work remains not in gold or glory, but in the quiet they taught themselves to enter. And you are there now. The world has paused, and in that pause you are free. You do not need to do anything. You do not need to become anything. Only rest, only drift, only sleep. Let the breath be soft. Let the weight slip gently from your shoulders. Let the hush remain unbroken. You have done enough. That is enough. That has always been enough.